Hi everyone, welcome to this AP Environmental Science PowerPoint on carrying capacity, population growth, and resource availability. This lecture is going to cover two topics, 3.4 and 3.5, in no specific order. We're actually going to talk about carrying capacity second, but these two topics are very much intertwined. The enduring understanding for both of them is that populations change over time in reaction to a variety of factors. So populations are dynamic. And the learning objectives for population growth and resource availability, we're looking at explaining how resource availability affects population growth. And then for carrying capacity, we have two learning objectives, just to be able to describe carrying capacity, and then describe the impact of carrying capacity on ecosystems. Vocab I'm going to skip as usual, but you can pause this and jot this down, make sure that you get it for later. And let's just jump right into how populations can grow depending on resource availability. In fact, populations can not only grow, but populations can remain stable or populations can decline in number. So population sizes are always going to be dynamic, and they're going to be dynamic across both space and time for any group of organisms. The size of that population, whether it is growing, whether it's stabilizing, or whether it's declining, so the trend in population size and the size itself, so the number of individuals in a population, is going to depend on every environmental factor that population or that organism is exposed to. This is typically resource availability. So we're looking at food or water if we're talking about animals. We're talking about space for every organism. If we're talking about plants, it could be sunlight, nutrients, in the soil. It could be water availability as well. And then breeding sites going back to animals as well. And I will have to point out and definitely emphasize, which is why it's bolded, that natural resources are always going to be finite. Every natural resource is finite. And we tend to overlook that as a species, but it is really important for this class that you understand that all natural resources are finite, meaning that they have an end. There is only so many of them out there. Okay. Now this should be relatively obvious and straightforward, but populations are going to grow when resources are abundant. Populations are going to decline when resources are limited, when there's not enough resources to go around, or when there's heavy predation or disease or anything like that. And populations are going to stabilize when populations are in equilibrium with the available resources. Now, populations are typically going to be in a what we call a dynamic equilibrium, if I can spell. And if you can read my terrible handwriting. A dynamic equilibrium means that it's basically at equilibrium, right? We have a graph and our population is going to be basically staying at the same size, but it's going to fluctuate a little bit. So you might be able to see that there is some ups and downs in that little bit of graph. Okay? Or populations can totally bounce up, decline, bounce up, decline. And that's what we see with these wolves and moose on Isle Royale in Michigan. So this is a island in Lake Superior that is right near the border with Canada. The US owns it and it is a national park. This is, it's home to a population of wolves and it's home to a population of moose. As far as I know, there's no other large grazing mammal on the island, so the moose is the wolf's main food source. Okay, so what you're going to see, I'll go blue for moose. Moose is on this y-axis over on the right, and we see number of moose ranging from 20 up to 2,000. And then wolves we're going to have in red. The wolves are on the left axis, and they're ranging from 0 up to 60. Okay. As moose increase in size, you will see that wolves tend to follow and increase in size. However, it takes a little bit of time. It might take a decade or 5 years or a couple years to reach that level. So moose increase, wolves will then increase. Because there's more wolves, there's more predation on the moose, and the moose populations are going to decline. Not only are the moose populations going to decline because of wolf predation, but there's going to be more moose in this relatively small island, and they're going to spread disease easier because they're in close contact with one another. They're going to potentially overgraze the island, so there's going to be less food to go around, and their populations are going to decline for a number of reasons. because the moose population is declining, initially the wolves are going to have a lot of food because they're eating or they're finding weak, diseased moose that are easy to take down. But eventually their populations are going to crash because there's not enough moose to go around, which is going to lead to decreasing wolf populations. They're not going to have enough individuals are going to starve, mothers are not going to produce enough milk to nurse all of their offspring, etc. And then with less predation, the moose population is going to rebound, and you're going to see this entire thing um, repeat itself. Okay, that's what we call a boom and bust cycle, like we've discussed before. And a lot of people will talk about how this is a very simple system where it's only predation and that's only predation causing this boom and bust cycle, but I do want to point out that there's other factors, including disease among both the wolves and the moose. When wolf populations get this high, there's going to be disease outbreaks because individuals are so close to each other and there's just more chance for disease. And then there's going to be overgrazing and all of that other stuff. So that's to illustrate these 2 points. Growth is going to accelerate when there's lots of resources. The wolf population is going to grow when there's lots of moose to eat. And then it's going to decline when there is less resources, when there's not as many moose to eat. Okay? And don't be surprised if you see Isle Royale reflected later on in the class or on the AP exam, because it is a very classic system. And this is real data. So this is a good use of real data. All right, and this brings us to limiting factors. Limiting factors are anything that constrains a population size. And there's 2 basic types. There's density-dependent limiting factors, and there's density-independent limiting factors. And these are going to, again, determine the population size. They're going to determine the carrying capacity for that population, and they're going to influence fluctuations in that population size. Let's start with density-dependent limiting factors. Density-dependent does rely on the population density, or it is a variable for which the population density does limit the population size. Okay, so the higher the population density, so the higher the pop density, I should just abbreviate that as a capital D because that's how you abbreviate density. The higher the population density, you're going to have a decrease in population size over time. Okay, so time passes and that population size is going to decrease because of several factors. There's going to be a decrease in competition among individuals, so there's not enough food to go around. There's going to be spread of disease, so more individuals are going to die as time passes due to disease because they're all living in very close proximity to one another, etc. Okay. To define population density, which I probably should have done at the beginning, population density is the number of individuals in a given geographic area. So we can do this mathematically, number of individuals in whatever your metric of geographic area is. Maybe it's meters squared, or maybe it's kilometers squared, or maybe it's hectares, or whatever it is. Okay? So that's a population density. The higher your density, the closer individuals are living together, the less space there is, the less food there might be, the less water there might be, the more competition is going to ensue for those resources, which are always finite, and the better chance for parasites and disease to spread. So disease loves, any pathogen loves a high population density because they can jump from one individual to another. For example, if we think about a respiratory illness, maybe COVID, individuals that are living in a tightly packed, dense apartment building are going to much likely spread COVID to one another than individuals that are living out in a rural area where you have like one farmer every couple miles down the road. Okay. That one farmer that's living 2 miles away from his closest neighbor can easily isolate, whereas somebody living in an apartment building with 10 kids in their apartment and 100 other renters in that same building easily spread disease. Density independent limiting factors are not reliant on the population density at all. to change the population size. So the population size is going to change, typically randomly and erratically, typically down, decrease in population, due to climatic or anthropogenic effects. So that could be a natural disaster. It could be human activity like spraying pesticides. There can be a natural selective process in this, and it can become density dependent in a sense, but we'll typically talk about it as being density independent. Okay, so for example, really bad, a couple years ago, there were really bad forest fires in Australia. And it doesn't matter how many koalas are in the forest. There can be 1 koala per hectare, or there can be 100 koalas per hectare, but the fires happens anyway, and the decrease in koala size, the decrease in koala population size, has nothing to do with the number of koalas per hectare. It can be 1 or 100 koalas per hectare, and that doesn't influence the fire at all. Okay, so unusual weather, climatic changes, natural disasters, and some human impacts are great examples of density independent limiting factors. So now that we've established that populations can increase and decrease, let's get to carrying capacity. So carrying capacity, you might remember from biology, is the population size that the environment can sustainably support for a long period of time, for an indefinite period of time. And it assumes stable environmental conditions over that entire period. And this is determined by those available resources. Okay, and again, remember that all available resources are finite. So for a population to stay at carrying capacity, let's just redraw this with a red line that stays right at carrying capacity or right below carrying capacity. That means that they have to be at equilibrium with resource use. So resource use is going to be at a renewable rate if they're at equilibrium. What we see here reflected in this graph originally was a dynamic equilibrium. Again, where populations increase and decrease and increase and decrease and hover around that carrying capacity, but they increase and decrease around that carrying capacity. Okay, and carrying capacity is going to be denoted as K. So you'll see K on graphs, and you'll see K further on in this lecture. I think that C was probably just taken, so they had to use another letter, so they use K. Even though we typically think about this as population size, we can extrapolate this to other scales. So maybe the total biosphere, the total biomass that Earth can support. There's a finite amount of resources in Earth's atmosphere, soil, space, etc. The amount of physical space on the Earth, not in space. And we can determine a total biomass carrying capacity for Earth. So carrying capacity you'll typically see as a very generic graph where we have population will always be on the y-axis and time will always be on the x-axis, but you rarely see absolute numbers. You never see a real population number. You rarely see time in years like we saw on the last graph on the last slide. Okay, carrying capacity again being in K. In this case we have a stable equilibrium, or what we would just might call an equilibrium. And carrying capacity is going to be the amount of organisms within a region that the environment can support indefinitely. So that's this dotted line, just the number of individuals. Let's say it's 2,500 right here. The number, like whatever number of individuals it is, it will be a real number for real populations. Stable equilibrium is going to be met when the populations align with the carrying capacity. Again, they're going to be using resources at a sustainable rate. I'll just say sustainably. Okay, slow growth is going to occur at the beginning, especially for your K selected species, because they have to get kind of the ball rolling, reproductively speaking, and a couple generations have to go before they get into this faster growth, just because they reproduce relatively slowly. Again, for K selected species, for R selected species, it'll go definitely faster. And recall that this is biotic potential. Okay, so that's what our fast growth is going to represent, realistically, the slow growth at the beginning as well. Okay, so the maximum reproductive rate when resources are plentiful, they're below carrying capacity, so the resources are going to be plentiful. And I should reiterate that K selected species or K strategists are called K selected because of carrying capacity, because they tend to equilibrate right at carrying capacity. So they have that logarithmic growth, they have that S-curve growth rate. Okay, so overshoot. Overshoot is going to happens right here when a population exceeds its carrying capacity. Essentially, biotic potential has so much momentum, and the animals, moose, deer, wolves, bison, whatever they don't know what carrying capacity is. They don't like take a census of their population and say, oh, okay, guys, we have 100,000 bison in this herd and we can't breed anymore. We have to limit our breeding so we don't overgraze the area. They don't do that. So they often overshoot the carrying capacity, which is right here. They would often overshoot the carrying capacity of, in this case, 1.6 million or thereabouts, and consequences can occur. Okay, we'll get to those consequences on the next slide. Okay, so that exponential growth has a little bit too much momentum, and they just breed too much and overshoot that carrying capacity. Okay, that excess number of individuals, that overshoot, has to be eliminated in the population for us to get back to carrying capacity. Okay, we tend to not eliminate them in one fell swoop. We tend, or like, guess I should say right to where they're right at carrying capacity, but we tend to eliminate it to where it's a little bit below. Individuals starve, individuals can't find enough space to breed, individuals can't, get enough nutrients out of the soil if it's plants, whatever. And then because the population size is now below carrying capacity, they'll pop back up, go through a little bit more exponential growth, pop back up, maybe have a little bit of overshoot again, and then go down below carrying capacity. And eventually, we're going to hover right at carrying capacity. Okay, we're going to kind of self-correct. Okay. Well, let's talk about the consequences of overshoot. Now, first off, there could be minimal disturbance. If overshoot is not too severe and it's not, maybe totally overgrazed or totally overhunted, or the habitat isn't totally destroyed, there can be minimal disturbance if that overshoot isn't too much, and it could result in carrying capacity staying at a level number or level population size. Okay. However, it could be or that we have any of these really severe impacts. It could be habitat degradation. Habitat degradation will reduce the carrying capacity. So instead of this carrying capacity staying at this single point, it could be that we reduce that habitat, or sorry, we degrade that habitat so much that the carrying capacity is now lowered. Okay. It could be that there's resource depletion, so that will go along with habitat degradation in most cases. So your food resources are depleted, your water is depleted. If it's totally depleted, that means that there is none left. Okay, so degradation will be there is some, it's impacted, it's cut back a little bit, but depletion would be zero. If we have depletion or even degradation, there could be a severe dieback of the population due to several reasons. It could be famine, so lack of food. It could be disease. It could be competition, and it could be decreased fecundity. Fecundity is the fertility potential of an individual. So if there is a lot of disease going through your population, coupled with famine, you're not going to have a lot of kids. There just isn't enough energy to reproduce. There's not enough energy to produce milk. There's not enough energy to produce large yolk if you're birds, etc. Okay. It could be so bad that your population and or your habitat does not recover after that overshoot. I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so some consequences of overshoot. I'm going to skip this first one because it's relatively straightforward and just go into the second one, which is a lot more specific and really illustrates the most severe consequences of overshoot. So St. Matthew Island is a small island in the Bering Sea between the US, Alaska, and Russia. and Japan, as you know, is just south of Russia. The US was at war with Japan during World War II, and the entire Pacific frontier was contested, and these islands in the Bering Sea, including St. Matthew and the Aleutian Islands, were strategic to prevent Japan from attacking the US mainland and Alaska. Okay. And then afterwards, they became very strategic in the Cold War as well. I guess at the time it was the USSR and not Russia because, World War II. St. Matthew Island, there was a small military base there, and the military personnel had to be resupplied from the US mainland. And let's say that there was a severe winter or really severe storms, and they just could not be resupplied. The ships could not make that, or the planes or whatever they used just could not make that trip. They had to have a mobile food supply, what they called a mobile food source, a backup food source. And that backup food source were reindeer or caribou. Now, caribou were brought to the island. They were introduced to the island. There were 0 caribou on the island beforehand, but it was perfect caribou habitat. They had the perfect food sources, the lichens and mosses that they love to eat, as well as the grasses and other things that they can eat. No predators besides humans. Perfect reindeer habitat. Population was so good that it went from the initial 29 to over 6,000 in just like a decade or so. And that exceeded the carrying capacity so bad that the population crashed to 0 by 1964. Degraded the habitat really, really bad. They overgrazed the entire island. The island has since recovered, but the caribou population was 0. They have not been introduced again, and it's going to remain 0 it's going to remain 0. Okay, so the point of this is that the carrying capacity, which I'll do in say a blue color, is right here. Let's say that it was 200 reindeer. They exceeded it so bad that the population overgrazed everything and crashed to 0 very, very quickly. Okay, that did degrade the habitat, so carrying capacity rather than being at 200 would then be around, let's say, 50, because there's just not enough plant matter that survives. But then eventually that plant matter does return. So the island has recovered, but the caribou population is going to remain at 0. Okay, let's look at another example. Smallpox historically has kept human populations in check. This is a density-dependent limiting factor. But smallpox was eradicated from the Horn of Africa, so in East Africa. That was a region that supported about 1 million people for centuries, for millennia. There's been about 1 million people in that area. All of a sudden, you remove the pressure of this disease, so that disease is gone, and suddenly populations explode. This is coupled with increased food supplies and globalization of markets and all of that stuff. So populations explode to about 14 million people. That has resulted in increased livestock grazing, which has resulted in overgrazing, which has led to the loss of biodiversity, which has led to as well as soil erosion, and that soil erosion leads to desertification. Okay, so just by eliminating a disease, we have exceeded carrying capacity in this area, which has environmental impacts, soil erosion, desertification, and loss of biodiversity. So speaking of humans, it's been estimated that Earth's carrying capacity for humans is around 2 billion individuals. Now, I've seen studies that have it as low as 1 billion. I've seen studies that have it as high as 5 or 6 billion. But the consensus seems to be at around 2 to 3 billion people, okay, that Earth can support over a very long period of time indefinitely without depletion of Earth's resources, okay? We've been in overshoot, if we use this 2 billion number, for about 100 years, and populations have only grown since. Okay, it's estimated that we're around 9.99 billion people as of recording this video. And this is coming at an environmental cost. So the environmental cost is reflected in this diagram. So the historic carrying capacity right here around 2 billion, if we're using that number. And this green is this after carrying capacity after right now carrying capacity, after the overshoot carrying capacity, um, we are degrading the environment so much that the capacity for the environment to support human life or human populations is less, and therefore supporting a smaller population. Okay, so you see that this is below that 2 billion. All right. Now that's best case scenario. That's if we can limit human population size around 3 billion, 4 billion, whatever it is. On this diagram, it's 3 billion. Now, we've obviously failed in doing that. Now, what we're looking at is current human population reaching that 8 billion mark, right? This diagram is a little bit dated because it was in the, let's say 2005 or something, where it was only around 7 billion. Okay, but we've filled that in. We're at 8 billion. Okay. Now, there has to be a reduction in population size. And what we've seen from natural history, from plant and animal life throughout the world, is that population reductions tends to be drastic and tends to be rapid. Okay. And what we always see in the plant and animal world is that it tends to, if we overshoot carrying capacity so much, it tends to degrade the habitat severely. And that's what we're also seeing with human population size, is that we're degrading the habitat. Okay, so there has to be, just mathematically and based on what we know about simple biology, a population correction, okay, which in this case is a drastic reduction in population size. And just to illustrate about how much above carrying capacity we are, it's estimated that 10,000 BC, okay, so not too terribly long ago in a geological sense, but very long ago in terms of a human societal sense, all wild animals, at least terrestrial vertebrates, I should say, all terrestrial vertebrates made up about 200 million tons of biomass. Okay, and then we have the carrying capacity shown right here, so we have K. Now, if we fast forward to today, I'm going to look at 2000. Humans are about that size, even larger. So over 200 million tons of biomass locked up in just human biomass. If we look at our domesticated animals, much more than has existed as terrestrial vertebrate biomass in the past, and wild animals only represent a very, very small portion of that. Okay, if we want to see what that biomass is, what it's represented by, we can use this graph on the right. So humans, again, with the red, occupying about as much or even more total biomass than all wild animals and humans did 10,000 years ago or 12,000 years ago. Okay, cattle, the vast majority of our domesticated animals in terms of biomass, and then pigs, chickens, sheep, horses, goats, cats, and dogs in descending order. Okay, all of our domesticated animals, except for apart from cows, represents about the carrying capacity in terms of biomass of the entire biosphere. Okay, so we are without doubt overshooting our carrying capacity, and we are putting strains on the Earth's systems that it has not seen in the past. And if we think about this as what Earth can support sustainably, this is unsustainable usage. Or a better phrase to say that would be unsustainable usage of resources. Okay, so couple more facts just to throw at you. 70% of the total mass of birds on the planet are domesticated. Most of those are chickens. There's about 23 billion chickens alive at any moment. So about between 2/3 and 3/4 of the entire biomass of birds is domesticated. 96% of the biomass of all mammals on Earth is our bodies plus our domesticated animals. About 1/3 of it is us, and about 2/3 of that 96% is domesticated animals. Okay, and then this diagram really illustrates that. If we have 8 billion humans on the planet, that's about that size of circle, just relatively speaking, compared to all the wild animals on the planet, which is much less, and our livestock and pets, all of our domesticated animals. This is about 2/3 of the mammalian biomass on the planet. This is about 1/3 of the mammalian biomass on the planet, and the wild animals is the remaining 4%. Okay, and then you see the tiny little dot right there for all elephants. We think about elephants as the big, massive mammals on the planet, at least terrestrial mammals, they are, but they represent a very, very, very small portion of all the mass on the planet. And I'll end with this recent quote by David Attenborough. This was from his 2022 book, A Life on Our Planet, and I'll just read this to you. Since the 1950s, on average, wild animal populations have more than halved. When I look back on my earlier films now, I realize that although I felt I was out there in the wild, wandering through a pristine natural world, that was an illusion. Those forests and plains and seas were already emptying. Many of the larger animals were already rare. A shifting baseline has distorted our perception of all life on Earth. We have forgotten that once there were temperate forests that would take days to traverse, herds of bison that would take 4 hours to pass, and flocks of birds so vast and dense that they darkened the skies. Those things were normal only a few lifetimes ago. Not anymore. We have become accustomed to an impoverished planet. We have replaced the wild with the tamed. We regard the Earth as our planet, run by humankind for humankind. There's little left for the rest of the world, little left for the rest of the living world. The truly wild world, that non-human world, has gone. We have overrun the Earth. Okay. This quote talks about not only our overshoot, the effects that we're having on the other living organisms that make up the majority of species on the planet, but also hits something that I want to discuss called a shifting baseline. Now, I added that bold in there because I want to, this is a vocab word for you guys. A shifting baseline is when there is a change so slow that it doesn't really register in our perception. Okay, it doesn't really register for over our single lifetime or a few years. Okay, it doesn't really register until you look at it over numerous lifetimes. So we are very used to the size of flocks of birds that we see today. If you see a flock of geese, a big flock today might be 50 geese, 100 geese. Okay, if you saw a flock of Canadian geese in the 1600s, the 1500s, 1000 AD, 2000 BC, you might see 200 geese in a flock. Okay, that's what we talk about with shifting baselines. It's when there's been changes that are relatively slow, but definitely pronounced that you have to look over several human generations to see. And each human generation alone does not really see it as a shift. We're used to a flock of pigeons that's 200 pigeons big. But if we were to see a flock of passenger pigeons that Henry David Thoreau saw in the mid 1800s, a flock so big that it darkened the sky, that would be something that we're just not accustomed to. Okay, so a shifting baseline we'll see come up again and again in our in this class. Okay, so going back to the essential knowledge for these two topics, population growth is limited by environmental factors. Those are density dependent and density independent limiting factors. They say especially resources in space. That's density dependent. Okay. Resource availability and the total resource base are limited and finite over all scales of time. There is only so many resources on the planet, no matter what organism you're looking at. They all require resources, and those resources are finite. When resources needed by a population for growth are abundant, population growth usually accelerates. Remember, that is basically our definition of biotic potential. And when resource base of a population shrinks, the increased potential for unequal distribution of resources will ultimately result in increased mortality, decreased fecundity, or both, resulting in population growth declining to or below carrying capacity. So when our resources are not plentiful, our resources shrink, there's not enough to go around, competition is going to increase, disease is going to increase, there's going to be increased mortality, decreased fecundity, populations are going to decrease. Okay, then we move over to carrying capacity. When a population exceeds its carrying capacity, that is overshoot. There are environmental impacts of overshoot, including resource depletion. Okay. And then a major ecological effect of population overshoot is dieback of the population. So that population has to correct below carrying capacity levels, and that is often severe or catastrophic. And that is due to, again, famine, disease, competition, conflict, etc. Okay, so I hope you learned something. Hope the last few slides weren't too much of a bummer, and I'll see you on class.